At exactly 5:59 p.m. on Christmas Eve, I sat alone in my quiet kitchen while 70 people stood inside Maple Ridge Hall, enjoying the party I had paid for every year, and pretending I was the one who always ruined it. Outside the frost-covered window, a heavy blanket of snow was falling over the street. The only light in the room came from the small, slightly lopsided artificial Christmas tree sitting on the counter. Elaine and I had bought that tree during our first year of marriage, back when we barely had enough money to keep the heat on. My phone lay face down on the wooden table, completely silent. I watched the second hand on the wall clock sweep upward. At 6 o'clock, it started ringing. I didn't reach for it. I just watched the screen light up in the dim room. The first call was from Mrs. Helen Carter, the general manager at Maple Ridge Hall. At exactly 6 o'clock, Maple Ridge Hall's final balance came due. For the first time in 20 years, my card was not on file. The phone rang 4 times, went to voicemail, and stopped. 10 seconds later, it rang again. This time, the caller ID showed the name of a high-end commercial bakery downtown. I let it ring out. 30 seconds passed. The screen lit up for the third time. It was my eldest daughter, Claire. Her custom ringtone echoed loudly in the small, empty kitchen. I took a sip of my black coffee, keeping my hands wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. The fourth call was from my son-in-law, Evan. The fifth call was from a distant cousin who hadn't spoken to me since Easter Sunday, but who suddenly cared very deeply about my whereabouts. I didn't answer any of them. I didn't silence the phone, and I didn't turn it off. I just sat there and let it ring, watching the frantic digital panic unfold on the small glass screen. For 20 years I had paid for Christmas. I had paid for the massive, elegant banquet hall. I had paid for the prime rib catering, the imported floral centerpieces, the professional lighting vendors, and the mountains of gifts that inevitably ended up wearing other people's names on the tags. For 20 years, I had quietly absorbed the financial burden of keeping my family together, convinced that my money was the only thing preventing us from drifting apart. And for 20 years, they had gladly taken the credit, accepted the applause, and treated me like the man who was ruining it. So this year, I stopped paying. I didn't scream at anyone. I didn't beg for their gratitude. I didn't send a single angry text message demanding to be respected. As a retired electrician who had spent 40 years fixing other people's broken circuits, I knew that arguing with a blown fuse was pointless. You don't yell at it, you just cut the power. This year, I cut the power. I let 6 o'clock do the talking. But to understand why I finally stopped answering the phone, you have to understand what happened 2 weeks earlier, during the final Christmas planning meeting at my daughter's house. I stood in the entryway of Claire and Evan's massive, newly renovated suburban home, quietly brushing the snow off my winter coat. The house was already buzzing with the familiar, suffocating energy of the annual Christmas planning meeting. For as long as I could remember, Claire had treated the holidays less like a family gathering and more like a theatrical production that she was directing, starring in, and aggressively managing. I hung my coat on a brass hook in the mudroom and walked into the sprawling, open-concept kitchen. The large marble island in the center of the room was covered with glossy spreadsheets, fabric swatches for table runners, and a highly detailed seating chart. Sitting around the island were my son, Luke, my older sister, Martha, and a smattering of cousins who had driven in from out of town to help assemble the gift bags. Standing at the head of the island, holding a silver clipboard and a pen, was my daughter. Claire was 38 years old, but when she was holding a clipboard, she possessed the intimidating authority of a corporate CEO who was deeply disappointed in her staff. "All right, let's keep this moving," Claire said briskly, tapping the pen against the marble. "We are only 2 weeks out from Christmas Eve, and we have 72 confirmed RSVPs. This year has to be flawless. I am not dealing with another incident like the mashed potato shortage of 2018. She looked down at her list. "Evan," she said, gesturing to her husband, who was leaning against the steel refrigerator, scrolling through his phone. You are in charge of the bar logistics. You need to make sure the bartenders know exactly when to cut off Uncle David. Last year, he tried to fight one of the valet. I'm on it, Evan said without looking up from his screen. I already spoke to the catering manager. The bar is handled. Evan was a commercial real estate broker. He wore custom-tailored suits to casual weekend barbecues and possessed a profoundly unearned sense of confidence. Over the years, he had slowly turned our family Christmas into a soft networking event for clients and neighbors he wanted to impress. He loved accepting their compliments about how generous he and Claire were for hosting such an extravagant event. He just conveniently omitted the part where he didn't pay for a single dime of it. Luke, Claire continued, turning to my son. Luke was 34, worked as an auto mechanic, and was the only person in the room who actually looked happy to see me when I walked in. He didn't have Evan's polished veneer or Claire's aggressive ambition. He had oil stains permanently worked into the calluses on his hands, and he had his mother's quiet, observant eyes. Yeah, Claire? Luke asked, leaning back in his bar stool. You're on heavy lifting duty, she instructed. When the tables arrive at the hall, I need you to supervise the setup. I have a very specific vision for the layout this year, and I don't want the rental guys scratching the floors. Sure thing, Luke said mildly. Aunt Martha, Claire said, turning to my older sister. You're bringing the pecan pies, correct? And only the pecan pies? We have a professional bakery handling the main desserts. I just need to make sure you aren't bringing that terrible fruit cake again. Martha, who was 64 and had never been afraid of Claire in her life, took a slow sip of her wine. I'll bring the pie, Claire. Try not to micromanage the pastry. Claire offered a tight, utterly humorless smile and finally turned her attention to me. I was standing near the edge of the kitchen, hovering just outside the circle of the marble island. My chest still felt tight from the cardiologist appointment earlier that afternoon. My pulse was still thrumming with the quiet, lingering anxiety of the $4,000 deposit check I had handed to Mrs. Carter at Maple Ridge Hall exactly 40 minutes ago. Claire looked at me, her expression softening into the kind of condescending, socially acceptable patience one might use when addressing a slightly confused toddler. Dad, she said, her voice dropping to a gentle, patronizing octave. You don't have to do anything. You've been looking a little tired lately. I can help with the setup, I offered quietly, or I can manage the coat check. Claire sighed, exchanging a quick, knowing glance with Evan. No, Dad, really, she said, offering a small, tight laugh. Just show up on time, sit at your table, and try not to make things awkward like last year. Remember when you cornered the florist and started lecturing him about the price of poinsettias? A few of the cousins chuckled politely. I was just asking him why he was charging a premium for a flower that is out of season, I said, my voice steady. It wasn't an argument. Well, it felt like an argument, Claire said dismissively, checking a box on her clipboard. And it stressed me out. This is my event, Dad. I need it to be perfect. So please just let me handle the details. Evan finally put his phone in his pocket and pushed off the refrigerator. He walked over to Claire, placing a heavy, possessive hand on her shoulder, and looked at me with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. Let the grown-ups handle it, Harold, Evan said smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. Claire and I have been running this show for years. We know what we're doing. You just show up, find a seat by the door, and stay warm. We'll take care of the rest. I looked at my son-in-law. I looked at the smug, entitled expression on his face. I looked at the expensive watch on his wrist and the custom leather loafers on his feet. And then I looked at Claire, my own daughter. She was smiling up at Evan, completely validating his disrespect. She wasn't defending me. She wasn't correcting him. She was actively participating in the illusion that they were the benevolent, capable adults and I was just an aging, difficult burden they were generous enough to tolerate. Neither of them knew that less than an hour ago, I had sat in a quiet office and signed my name on the bottom line of a catering contract that cost more than Evan's first car. They didn't know that the open bar Evan was bragging about managing was funded entirely by a credit card bearing my name. They didn't know that the massive 70-person banquet room they were currently assigning seating charts for was secured by a check drawn from my retirement account. They didn't know because for 20 years, I had never made them acknowledge it. I had paid the venue. I had paid the caterers. I had paid the cleanup fees. When Evan inevitably blew past the bar tab limit every single year, ordering top-shelf whiskey for his friends to show off, the venue manager didn't bring the overage bill to him. She brought it to me, and I always paid it quietly, slipping my card to the bartender so the party wouldn't be interrupted. Christmas didn't arrive by magic. It didn't arrive because Claire owned a clipboard, or because Evan wore a nice suit. It arrived because my name was at the bottom of every single contract. "All right," I said softly, looking away from Evan's smug face. "I'll stay out of your way." "Thank you, Dad," Claire said, visibly relieved. "It really is better for everyone." I didn't argue. I didn't remind them of the truth. I just turned around and walked out of the kitchen, pulling my winter coat back off the hook in the mudroom. As I walked out to my truck in the freezing driveway, I could hear sounds of laughter echoing from the warm kitchen behind me. They were laughing. They were celebrating their own generosity. They thought I was a guest who ruined Christmas. They had no idea I was the only reason the doors opened. My name is Harold Bennett. I am 61 years old. For most of my adult life, I worked as an independent commercial electrician and maintenance supervisor. I am a man who builds things with his hands, fixes things when they break, and prefers to remain quietly in the background while doing so. I have never been the loudest voice in the room, and I have never sought the spotlight. My late wife, Elaine, was the exact opposite. Elaine was the heart, the soul, and the absolute center of gravity for our family. She loved crowded rooms, loud conversations, and massive holiday gatherings. When the kids were young, our house on Christmas Eve was a chaotic, beautiful explosion of wrapping paper, relatives, and the smell of roasting turkey. Elaine was the maestro of it all, conducting the holiday with a joyful, infectious energy that made everyone feel like they belonged. I loved watching her shine. I was perfectly content to stay in the background, checking the Christmas lights for frayed wires, carving the meat, and silently making sure everyone's glass was full. But 20 years ago, a drunk driver ran a red light on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and Elaine was killed instantly. When she died, the music in our house stopped. Our two children, Claire and Luke, were devastated. The holidays, which had once been the focal point of our year, suddenly felt like a massive, insurmountable burden. The silence in the house on that first Christmas Eve without her was deafening. It was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I was terrified. I looked at my children, who were grieving and drifting, and I realized that without Elaine to anchor us, the family was going to shatter. They were going to scatter to the wind, finding their own separate lives. And we would become one of those tragic families who only ever saw each other at funerals. I couldn't let that happen. I had to keep the tradition alive. But I didn't have Elaine's warmth. I didn't have her natural ability to organize, to host, and to make people feel magical. So, I used the only tool I had left. I used my wallet. The year after Elaine died, I booked a small event space for Christmas Eve. By the time Claire married Evan, the gathering had grown into a massive 70-person event. At first, paying for it was an act of sheer love and desperation. But as the years went by, it mutated into an expected habit. Claire and Evan eagerly took over the hosting duties, accepting the glowing praise of our relatives while I became the awkward guest. I was seated near the coat check. I was the old man who supposedly ruined the vibe. Every time something went wrong, if the food was late or the music was too loud, Someone inevitably muttered that it was because I had made things awkward. But every time they needed to increase the catering budget, or expand the floral arrangements, or cover the massive bar overages that Evan racked up showing off to his friends, the phone calls always came straight to my phone. The blame came in the evening, the bill came in the morning. And for 20 years, I paid both. I never corrected them. I never stood up and asked for a round of applause. I just quietly paid the bill, deeply grateful that they had all shown up, terrified that if the music stopped playing, they would never come back. That illusion remained entirely unchallenged until the afternoon of the planning meeting. Just a few hours before Claire and Evan laughed at me in their kitchen, I had been sitting on a crinkling paper sheet in an examination room at my cardiologist's office. The doctor had been blunt. After 40 years of physical labor and the quiet, crushing stress of managing the family's escalating holiday expenses on a fixed retirement income, my heart was showing signs of significant strain. "You need to slow down, Harold," the doctor had warned me, looking over my EKG results with a grim expression. "You need to reduce your stress, and you need to stop carrying burdens that don't belong to you. Your heart literally cannot take it." I had nodded, taken the prescription for the blood pressure medication, and driven straight from the hospital to Maple Ridge Hall. I had walked into Mrs. Carter's office. My chest felt tight, my breathing was shallow, and my hands were shaking slightly. But I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my checkbook, and handed her a check for $4,000 to cover the initial catering and venue deposit for the upcoming party. If I stop paying, I had thought to myself as I signed the contract, maybe they will stop coming. It was a pathetic, fearful thought, but it was the absolute truth. I was an old man buying the illusion of a family. I had driven home from the banquet hall feeling utterly exhausted. When I walked into my house, my phone had buzzed with the text message from Claire demanding my presence at her planning meeting. I hadn't wanted to go. I had wanted to sit in my armchair, take my medication and rest. But the fear of losing them, the fear of Elaine's family finally fracturing, had pushed me back out the door, into the cold, and straight into the kitchen where my son-in-law told me to sit in a corner and stay out of the way. I had walked out of their house that night, believing that I just had to survive one more year. I thought the money was keeping us together. I didn't realize it was the only reason they kept a chair for me. The breaking point didn't happen in a massive, screaming argument. It didn't happen over a misplaced seating chart or a ruined turkey. It happened quietly on a freezing Tuesday afternoon, 2 days after the planning meeting. Claire had sent me a text message earlier that morning. "Dad, I need the extra folding chairs from your garage. We're doing a pre-Christmas cocktail hour with the neighbors tonight, and I'm short on seating. Can you drop them off by 4? There was no please. There was no if you have the time. It was a directive I didn't mind. After 40 years of working as an electrician, I was used to being the man people called when they needed something functional, heavy, or broken to be handled. I went into my cold garage, loaded 6 heavy steel folding chairs into the bed of my truck, and drove across town to their house. When I pulled into their expansive driveway, the front door was locked. I could hear music and the low hum of conversation coming from the backyard. I hauled the stack of metal chairs out of the truck bed, hoisting them awkwardly against my chest. They were heavy, and my heart gave a familiar dull throb of protest against my ribs as I carried them up the stone path that led around the side of the house toward the back patio. As I approached the wooden gate, I heard Evan's voice. He was speaking loudly, clearly holding court. He had that booming, overly confident tone he always used when he was trying to impress potential real estate clients or affluent neighbors. I paused with my hand on the metal latch of the gate, trying to catch my breath before I walked in and interrupted the party. "I'm telling you, Mark, the logistics are a nightmare," Evan was saying, followed by the clinking of a glass. Hosting 70 people on Christmas Eve is practically a full-time job. I spent 3 hours on the phone with the venue manager yesterday, just finalizing the bar inventory. I stood perfectly still. Evan hadn't spent a single minute on the phone with Mrs. Carter. He hadn't even looked at the bar inventory. I had reviewed the inventory sheet the previous morning and paid the deposit for the top-shelf liquor he had requested. "Man, I don't know how you and Claire do it," a neighbor's voice replied, sounding genuinely impressed. "My wife and I hosted 12 people last year, and we nearly got a divorce. It's incredibly generous of you guys to put all that together." "Well, somebody has to step up and keep the family together," Evan said smoothly. "Honestly, the hardest part isn't the vendors. It's Claire's dad." My hand tightened on the cold metal latch of the gate. The heavy stack of folding chairs suddenly felt like an anchor pressing into my chest. "Harold?" the neighbor asked. "He seems like a quiet guy." "He is," Evan said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But he's difficult. He's stuck in his ways. Honestly, Christmas runs a lot smoother when Harold stays out of it. Claire and I carry the whole thing. The old man just shows up, sits in the corner, and usually finds a way to ruin the vibe. But what can you do? You have to tolerate family, right?" A chorus of sympathetic, knowing chuckles rippled through the group of men on the patio. I stood there in the freezing cold, the snow soaking through the knees of my jeans, and waited. I waited for Claire to speak. I knew she was out there. I could hear her laughing lightly in the background. I waited for my daughter, the little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the woman whose entire lavish holiday production was currently being funded by my retirement savings, to step in. I waited for her to correct him. I waited for her to say, "Actually, my dad pays for the venue," or "Actually, my dad covers the catering," or even just, "Don't talk about my father that way." She didn't say any of those things. Instead, I heard Claire's voice chime in, bright and agreeable. "Evan is right," Claire said with a dramatic sigh. "Dad is he's a lot to manage. I love him. But keeping him happy during the holidays is practically its own event." The men on the patio laughed again. I didn't open the gate. I didn't step onto the patio and drop the chairs onto the expensive composite decking. I didn't yell. I didn't demand an apology or violently yank the curtain back on their pathetic self-serving illusion. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs, echoing the cardiologist's warning. The cold air stung my lungs. I quietly leaned the 6 heavy steel chairs against the wooden fence. I turned around, walked back down the stone path, climbed into the cab of my truck, and drove home. When I walked through my front door, the silence of my own house hit me differently than it usually did. For 20 years, this silence had felt like a failure. It had felt like the absence of Elaine. It had felt like an empty void that I desperately needed to fill by renting banquet halls and buying prime rib for people who didn't respect me. But tonight, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt clarifying. I made a pot of black coffee. I walked into my small home office, turned on the desktop computer, and opened my digital banking archives. I sat there for 3 hours, pulling up the statements for every single December, going back 2 decades. I looked at the receipts for Maple Ridge Hall, the catering deposits, the high-end bakeries, the custom floral arrangements, the professional lighting, the exorbitant cleanup fees, the massive bar overages that Evan racked up every year buying drinks for his friends. I even looked at the Amazon receipts for the expensive gifts I had bought for my grandchildren. The iPads, the bicycles, the gaming consoles, gifts that Claire always insisted on wrapping herself, so she could put her and Evan's names on the tags. "It's better for the kids if it comes from us, Dad T," she had said. And I had let her do it. I totaled the numbers. Over 20 years. The amount of money I had quietly poured into the illusion of a happy family was staggering. It was enough to have paid off a second mortgage. It was enough to have fully funded a comfortable, stress-free retirement. It was enough to guarantee that my heart wouldn't be failing me at 61. But as I stared at the final, glowing number on the screen, I realized that the financial loss wasn't what was breaking my heart. The money was just paper. I could live without the money. What broke me was the realization of what I had actually bought. In 20 years of paying, I could not remember one single Christmas where I felt like a father. I couldn't remember one single holiday where I was treated like a patriarch, a mentor, or even just a respected elder. I had been treated like a wallet with a pulse. I was an ATM machine that they kept in the corner by the coat check, only useful when the bills came due, and easily discarded the moment the music started playing. I looked up from the computer screen. I looked out the window at the snow falling gently in the dark. I thought about Elaine. I thought about the promise I had made to myself to keep our family together at all costs. But as I sat in the quiet glow of the monitor, I finally understood the truth. The family Elaine had built was already gone. I hadn't kept them together. I had just bribed them into pretending. I reached forward and closed the laptop. That was the night I stopped funding the lie. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. I didn't feel angry. The hot, suffocating spike of betrayal I had felt on the patio the day before had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, absolute clarity. I made a pot of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I pulled up the master contact list for the Christmas party, a list that Claire had meticulously typed up, but that I had meticulously funded. At exactly 9 a.m., I made the first phone call. Maple Ridge Hall. This is Helen Carter speaking. Mrs. Carter, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. This is Harold Bennett. Oh, Mr. Bennett. Good morning, she replied warmly. We received your deposit check yesterday. Everything is perfectly on track for the 24th. We are just waiting on Claire to finalize the linen colors. That's what I'm calling about, Mrs. Carter, I said. I need to make a change to the account. Of course. What do you need? I need you to remove my name, my credit card, and my financial authorization from the Christmas Eve reservation, I said. I am no longer the account holder for this event. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. When Mrs. Carter finally spoke, her voice had dropped the cheerful customer service tone and shifted into genuine confusion. Mr. Bennett, are you canceling the Christmas party? No, I replied calmly. I'm not canceling Christmas. I'm just removing my name from the bill. If my daughter wants to keep the reservation, she is more than welcome to rebook it under her own name, with her own credit card, assuming full financial responsibility. Mrs. Carter was a professional who had managed banquet halls for 30 years. She knew family drama when she heard it. She didn't press for details, but her voice softened with a subtle, unmistakable note of empathy. She knew exactly who had been paying the bills for the last 20 years while Evan strutted around her lobby. I understand, Mr. Bennett, she said quietly. I'll mark your deposit as transferable only if Mrs. Whitmore signs a new contract under her own name. The remaining balance for the hall, the catering, and the open bar is due at exactly 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve. If the contract isn't transferred by then, we will have to suspend service. I understand, I said. Thank you, Helen. I hung up. I looked at the next name on the list. Over the next 45 minutes, I made 6 more phone calls. I called the high-end commercial bakery that was providing the massive dessert spread. I called the professional lighting company that was supposed to string up the winter wonderland canopy. I called the florist, the rental outfit providing the extra folding tables, the independent catering staff, and the premium bar service. Every single time, I delivered the exact same uncompromising message. I am not canceling the order. If my daughter wants the items, she can keep them. I am just no longer the account holder. By 10 a.m., I had systematically dismantled 20 years of financial dependency. The power was cut. The circuit was broken. I picked up my cell phone, opened a new text message, and typed out a short note to my daughter. Claire, I won't be attending Christmas this year. I've removed my name and my payment information from all of the vendor accounts. If you and Evan wish to continue hosting the party, you will need to contact the vendors today and place the contracts under your own names." I hit send. The response was not immediate. I imagined she was staring at her phone in her massive, beautifully decorated kitchen, trying to process a boundary she had never encountered before. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. I answered it. "What is this?" Claire demanded, her voice vibrating with a mixture of shock and immediate, defensive anger. "What kind of sick joke is this, Dad?" "It's not a joke, Claire," I said simply. "I'm stepping back. You can't do this," she yelled. "It's 2 weeks before Christmas. I have 70 people RSVP'd. I just got an email from Helen Carter saying the deposit was voided. Do you have any idea how much money that is?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I know exactly how much it is, because I'm the one who has paid it every single year since your mother died." That statement hung in the air, dense and undeniable. Claire hesitated, the wind briefly knocked out of her sails by a truth she had spent 2 decades aggressively ignoring. But Claire was an expert at redirecting blame. "You're punishing the children," she accused, weaponizing my grandchildren against me. "You're ruining their Christmas just because you're in a bad mood." "No," I replied, my voice hard and steady. "I'm refusing to keep paying for adults who call me a burden." She gasped. She knew exactly what I had heard on the patio. I didn't wait for her to formulate an excuse. I hung up the phone. By noon, the fallout had begun. Claire immediately deployed her favorite tactic, mobilizing the extended family to apply emotional pressure. My phone buzzed with text messages from cousins I hadn't seen since the summer, telling me I was being selfish. A distant aunt called to lecture me about the spirit of the holidays. Claire was spinning a narrative that I was having some kind of mental breakdown, that I was trying to sabotage her perfect event out of spite. I ignored all of it. But at 3 p.m., the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Evan standing on my front porch. He pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, walking into my living room and standing in the center of the rug with his hands on his hips. He was wearing an expensive wool overcoat and an expression of profound irritation, like a boss who had just caught an employee trying to quit early. "All right, Harold, let's wrap up this little tantrum," Evan said, checking his watch. "Claire has been crying for 3 hours. The vendors are calling my phone. You need to call Maple Ridge Hall right now and put your card back on file so we can move past this." I stood by the front door, looking at the man who had built his entire social reputation on my dime. "I'm not putting my card back on file, Evan," I said. Evan scoffed, shaking his head. "Look, if you're upset about what I said yesterday, you're being overly sensitive. It was just guys venting. You're taking it entirely out of context," I said coldly. "Is that you told your neighbors you carry the weight of this family, and that I am a burden you are generous enough to tolerate." Evan's jaw tightened. He realized I wasn't going to be bullied into a quick apology. He dropped the casual, dismissive tone and shifted to aggression. "You can't back out now," Evan demanded, stepping toward me. "You made a commitment to this family." "No, Evan," I corrected him softly, looking him dead in the eye. "You made an assumption." I opened the front door wider. "Get out of my house." Evan stared at me, his face flushing with anger. He wasn't used to anyone telling him no, and he certainly wasn't used to me setting a boundary. He walked out onto the porch, turning back one last time. "You're going to regret this, Harold," he spat. "You're going to destroy this family." I closed the door in his face. I fully expected them to cancel the event. I expected the 70 RSVPs to be retracted and the massive banquet hall to sit empty on Christmas Eve. But I had underestimated the sheer, blinding power of Evan's ego and Claire's absolute refusal to lose face in front of the neighbors. The next day, I received an automated confirmation email from Maple Ridge Hall. The reservation had been restored. Claire had transferred the contracts into her own name. She booked the party anyway. She didn't do it because they had the extra cash lying around. She did it because she was betting on the one thing I had trained her to believe over the last 20 years. Dad always folds. She truly believed that when the final, massive bill came due at 6 o'clock on Christmas Eve, I wouldn't be able to stand the guilt. She believed I would walk through the doors of the banquet hall, pull out my credit card, and rescue them from the consequences of their own entitlement. She was wrong. The snow was falling heavily over the city on Christmas Eve, covering the streets in a thick, insulating quiet. I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee. My wallet was sitting on the counter, next to the small, lopsided artificial tree. I hadn't put on a suit. I hadn't shaved. For the first time in 2 decades, I was spending the holiday alone. But 3 miles away, Maple Ridge Hall was operating at maximum capacity. Luke had called me earlier in the afternoon to tell me he was still going. I had encouraged him to do so. I didn't want my children taking sides, and more importantly, I knew I needed someone in that room who actually understood the truth. Luke was my quiet, grease-stained witness. Through the text messages Luke sent me, I knew exactly what the banquet hall looked like when the 70 guests arrived at 5 o'clock. It was a masterpiece of seasonal aesthetics. The massive room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of professional lighting. A towering, professionally decorated Christmas tree stood in the center of the hall, surrounded by mountains of perfectly wrapped gifts. The long banquet tables were draped in heavy, cream-colored linens, adorned with imported floral centerpieces. The open bar was fully stocked, and the catering staff was moving silently through the crowd, carrying trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. And near the coat check, at a small table far away from the center of the action, there was a single, empty chair. Claire was in her element. She was wearing a stunning, floor-length velvet dress, standing near the entrance and greeting the guests as they arrived. She was playing the role of the benevolent, exhausted, but ultimately triumphant hostess to absolute perfection. Whenever a cousin or an aunt asked where I was, Claire offered a practiced, sympathetic smile. "Dad isn't feeling very well," she would say, pitching her voice so that the people standing nearby could hear her bravery. "He might come later, you know how he is. We just want him to rest. Evan and I can handle everything here." Evan, meanwhile, was holding court near the open bar, a glass of expensive bourbon in his hand, loudly accepting the lavish praise of his neighbors for funding such an incredible spread. It was a flawless, beautiful illusion. But as the clock ticked closer to 6, the edges of the illusion began to crack. The vendors were professionals. They knew exactly how to run an event without disrupting the guests, but they also knew exactly when their invoices were due. At 5:30 p.m., the lead bartender quietly approached Evan and asked for a credit card to open the tab, since the previous authorization had been voided. Evan, caught off guard, waved the man away, telling him that his wife was handling the logistics. At 5:40 p.m., Claire's cell phone rang. It was the bakery, politely but firmly requesting verbal confirmation of the final payment before the dessert spread was released from the delivery van in the loading dock. Claire laughed it off, stepping into the hallway to stall them. At 5:50 p.m., the representative from the lighting company approached Claire near the coat check, asking for a signature and a final swipe of a card. Claire's flawless hostess smile was beginning to look tight and frantic. She was pacing near the entrance, constantly checking her phone, desperately waiting for me to walk through the heavy wooden doors and rescue her from the mounting financial reality of her own party. She still believed I was going to fold. She still believed that my need for family was greater than my need for respect. At exactly 5:58 p.m., Mrs. Helen Carter, holding a thick leather folder, walked across the banquet hall and pulled Claire aside. "Mrs. Whitmore," Helen said quietly, keeping her voice low so the nearby guests wouldn't hear. "The final balance is due at 6 o'clock, the bar, the catering, and the venue fee. If we don't have a card on file by then, I'm required to pause dinner service and close the bar until the balance is settled. Claire turned pale. The reality of the situation finally pierced through her entitlement. She realized, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that she was about to be publicly humiliated in front of 70 people. At 6 o'clock, the moment I had already seen coming finally arrived. My phone lit up exactly the way I knew it would. First Mrs. Carter, then the bakery, then Claire. I sat in the quiet kitchen and let it ring. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of exhaustion. The phone stopped ringing for a full minute. Then it lit up again. This time, the caller ID didn't say Claire. It didn't say Evan. It said Martha. My older sister. I stared at the screen. Martha wasn't someone who panicked. She wasn't someone who got involved in unnecessary drama. If Martha was calling me, it wasn't to guilt-trip me or to ask for money. I picked up the phone and pressed answer. Harold, Martha said. Her voice was sharp, steady, and cut through the ambient noise of the banquet hall in the background. Martha, I replied quietly. I'm not coming to pay the bill. I know you aren't, she said. But you need to come here. I already said everything I need to say. No, you didn't, Martha countered, her voice dropping into a fierce, protective register that I hadn't heard since we were children. This isn't about the money, Harold. Claire is standing in the middle of this room, and she is about to find out what it means to stand on her own for the first time in her entire life. She's terrified. I closed my eyes, the instinct to protect my daughter flaring up instantly, despite everything she had done. Martha, listen to me, Martha interrupted aggressively. Claire is about to fall. Let her fall. But when she does, everyone in this room is finally going to find out who gave them 20 Christmases. Evan is going to be exposed. The cousins who called you selfish are going to realize they've been eating your food. I looked across the kitchen at my wallet, sitting on the counter. You're not coming here to pay, Martha told me, her voice filled with absolute resolve. You're coming here to be seen. Do not let them write the ending to this story, Harold. Get in your truck. The line clicked dead. I sat in the silence for a long moment, listening to the snow hitting the window glass. I stood up. I put on my winter coat. I reached into my pocket and grabbed my truck keys. I looked at my wallet, sitting next to the lopsided little Christmas tree. I left the wallet on the counter. I walked out into the freezing night, climbed into my truck, and started the engine. For the first time in 20 years, I was walking into Christmas with empty pockets. When I walked through the heavy double doors of Maple Ridge Hall, the ambient noise in the room immediately shifted. The 70 people inside, my relatives, my neighbors, Evan's affluent real estate clients, turned to look at me. I was wearing a simple winter coat over a flannel shirt and jeans. I didn't look like a man arriving to celebrate. I looked like a man arriving to work. Claire, who had been standing near the coat check looking as pale as a ghost, let out a massive, visible sigh of relief. The frantic panic in her eyes was instantly replaced by the absolute certainty that her safety net had finally arrived. She walked quickly across the room toward me, forcing a bright, host-like smile for the benefit of the watching crowd. Dad, thank God you're here, Claire said, her voice carrying a thin, desperate edge. Please, talk to Mrs. Carter. Tell them there's been a massive misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding, Claire, I said quietly. Her smile faltered. The desperation bubbled up, bleeding directly into the entitlement she had been practicing for 2 decades. Unable to handle the stress, she reverted immediately to her favorite, most reliable script in front of everyone. You're ruining Christmas again, Dad, Claire said, her voice rising sharply enough for the front half of the room to hear. Why do you always have to make things so difficult? Why can't you just let us have one nice night? I looked at my daughter. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, flat authority of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. No, I said. I just stopped paying for a party I was never really invited to. The room went dead silent. The low hum of conversations stopped. The clinking of glasses ceased. 70 pairs of eyes darted between me, Claire and Evan, who was suddenly frozen near the open bar. Mrs. Carter stepped forward. She didn't want to humiliate anyone, but she was running a business, and the deadline had passed. "I'm incredibly sorry to interrupt," Mrs. Carter said, her professional voice ringing clearly in the silent hall. "I just need someone to settle tonight's balance. Every Christmas before this one was booked under Mr. Bennett's name. The hall, the catering, the open bar, and the cleanup. He always paid in full. But this year, the account was transferred into Mrs. Whitmore's name." The silence in the room became suffocating. The truth, unvarnished and undeniable, had just been dropped directly into the center of the room. The neighbors who had just spent the last hour praising Evan for his incredible generosity slowly turned to look at him. The cousins who had been eating the prime rib looked down at the floor. The people who had muttered that I was ruining the vibe suddenly looked at the single, empty chair near the coat check with profound realization. Luke stepped out from the crowd. He walked over and stood directly beside me. "You all called him the problem," Luke said, his voice hard. "But he paid for the hall, the food, the lights, and the gifts. Then you sat him by the door." Martha stepped out next, standing on my other side. "Harold didn't ruin Christmas," my sister announced to the stunned room. "He kept it alive while you laughed at him." Evan, desperate to salvage his reputation in front of his clients, finally moved from the bar. His face was flushed crimson. "All right, that's enough," Evan said, trying to project his usual authority, though his voice shook slightly. "This is private family business. We don't need to discuss this here." I looked directly at Evan. I let the silence stretch for 3 seconds before I spoke. "Then maybe you shouldn't have discussed it with your neighbors on the patio," I said quietly. Evan's jaw snapped shut. He was completely speechless. A few of the neighbors in the crowd, the men who had been standing on the patio with him 2 days ago, exchanged knowing, deeply uncomfortable glances. They understood immediately. I didn't look at Evan anymore. I turned back to Claire. She was crying now. Not fake tears, not manipulative tears to get her way. They were the tears of a woman who was finally seeing the massive, crushing weight of reality crashing down on her carefully curated illusion. "I loved doing this in the beginning, Claire," I told her softly. "After your mother died, Christmas was how I held us together. But somewhere along the way, I started believing that the only way to keep my family was to pay for them. And once you believe that, people will let you." Claire covered her mouth with her hand, a small sob escaping her throat. "I'm not angry with you," I said, "and I meant it, but I'm finished paying to be the joke at the end of the room." I looked around the banquet hall one last time. "From now on, whoever hosts the party pays for the party," I announced clearly. "I will still come if I'm wanted. But I will come as a father, not as a checkbook." I didn't wait for an apology. I turned around and walked out the double doors, leaving them to deal with the bill. I drove home with the radio off. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't wondering whether they were angry with me. I was wondering why it had taken me so long to let them be. The party ended early. There was no magical rescue. Claire had to max out her personal credit card to cover half the balance, and she had to sign a humiliating, heavily interest-bearing payment plan with Maple Ridge Hall for the rest. Evan's reputation among his affluent neighbors was completely shattered. The man who supposedly carried the whole thing couldn't even cover the bar tab he had bragged about. The week after Christmas, Claire came to my house. She didn't have her silver clipboard. She didn't have her bright, aggressive CEO voice. She looked exhausted, humbled, and small. We sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee in the same silence that had started this entire chain of events. "I saw the final numbers, Dad," Claire said quietly, staring into her mug. "I looked at what you've been paying." "I never knew." "I know," I replied. I made it very easy for you not to." She wiped a tear from her cheek. "I don't know how to do Christmas. I'm 38 years old and I don't know how to host a party that I actually have to pay for." I looked at my daughter, my instinct, the deeply ingrained, protective, fatherly instinct that had driven me for 2 decades, screamed at me to pull out my phone, open my banking app, and transfer the funds to cover her debt with Mrs. Carter. I almost did it. My hand actually reached for the phone. But right as my fingers brushed the screen, the phone buzzed. It was 2 text messages, arriving simultaneously. "Luke, don't do it, Dad. Whatever you're thinking, don't, Martha. If she asks for money, the answer is the exact same as last week." I smiled faintly and pulled my hand back from the phone. "You'll learn, Claire," I said gently. "It's not too late." That was the hardest part. The hardest part wasn't standing up to Evan or walking out of the banquet hall. The hardest part was actively choosing not to rescue my own daughter from a lesson she desperately needed to learn. A year later, we had Christmas again. There was no Maple Ridge Hall. There were no rented linens, no professional lighting vendors, and no 70-person guest list. It was held at my house. It was smaller, louder, and infinitely more real. Luke brought his new girlfriend. Martha arrived 2 hours early and immediately started bossing me around in my own kitchen. Claire brought a casserole she had cooked herself. It was slightly burned on the edges, but she served it with genuine pride. My grandchildren sat on the floor, tearing open, modest, thoughtfully chosen gifts right next to the lopsided artificial tree Elaine and I had bought 40 years ago. And when dinner was served, I didn't sit at a small table near the coat check. I sat at the head of the table, not because I had paid for the food, but because my family had placed me there. After dinner, Claire walked over to the kitchen sink where I was washing dishes. She stood beside me for a long time, drying a plate with a towel. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly, "for all those years." I never once said it because I never even saw it. I stopped scrubbing. I looked at her, and the last lingering shred of resentment in my chest finally evaporated. "I forgive you, Claire," I said. For the first time in 20 years, holding my daughter didn't cost me a dime, and it was worth more than every check I had ever written.